Well, our reading for this Sunday is from everybody's favorite book, Leviticus. The second chapter, just a short reading. When anyone presents a grain offering to the Lord, the offering shall be of choice flour. The worshiper shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. After taking from it a handful of the choice flour and oil with all of its frankincense, the priest shall turn this token portion into smoke on the altar, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. And what is left of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons, a most holy part of the offerings by fire to the Lord. Our reading for this morning. May God bless it. Well, I wanted to talk this morning about sacrifice, about reconciling ourselves with the notion of sacrifice. You know, if we believe what we read about ourselves, we're not very good at sacrificing. We want it all, and we want it now, and we're not willing to give up anything to get what we want. I'm not sure that's an accurate portrayal of the way we are, but it's what we are being told about the way we are. Now, I choose this reading from Leviticus because it describes one of the simplest and most common of all the many different kinds of sacrifices. The burnt offering of grain is usually given as an offering of thanks. And you heard how it works. The worshiper brings a small bag of grain, not the stuff that the elevator downgraded, but the good stuff, because we always want to give our very best to God. And the priest sets most of that grain aside to feed himself and his family. Remember that in ancient Israel, the priests were not allowed to do any other work except for their priestly duties. Their only income came from a portion of the people's offerings. And you know, it still pretty much works that way. I don't offer any sacrifices, but my income still comes from a portion of your offerings. But now we get to the critical moment in all of this. After taking from the bag of grain, a handful of the choice flour and oil, olive oil, the very best olive oil, to help it burn, and frankincense on it to make it smell nice, the priest shall turn this token portion into smoke on the altar, an offering by fire of a pleasing odor to the Lord. Now, the pleasing odor is not the important part. We're told repeatedly in other places that God is not moved by pleasing odors. The critical piece here is this: turns this token portion into smoke on the altar. This is about transformation. And it's not about a destructive transformation, about turning the grain into ashes. It's about a life-giving transformation, turning the grain into smoke. Physical. The tangible becomes intangible. Physical grain becomes ethereal smoke. The physical becomes the spiritual. And what's in it for the worshiper is an opportunity to participate in that physical to spiritual transformation. That transformation is what we call a religious experience. To be reminded that there is more to life than what we can touch, that there is more to living than the bottom layer of Maslow's pyramid, food and water and shelter. That what Jesus called abundant life happens in the heart and in the soul as well as in the body. Now, my understanding, and you're entitled to disagree with me at any time, but my understanding is that the essential element in biblical sacrifice is the opportunity for ordinary people to act out their own personal transformations. Sacrifice is part of our conversation today, of course, because this is Remembrance Sunday. And this year, the ultimate sacrifice of Nathan Cirillo and Patrice Vincent serve as stark reminders of the costs of our freedoms, the price that has been paid to obtain them, and the price that is yet being paid to protect them. Heather Robertson, in her book, A Terrible Beauty, The Art of Canada at War, writes, "We must remember If we do not, the sacrifice of those 100,000 Canadian lives will be meaningless. They died for us, for their home and families and friends, for a collection of traditions they cherished and a future they believed in. They died for Canada. The meaning of their sacrifice rests with our collective national consciousness. Our future is their monument. I really like that. Our future is their monument. Now, the killing of 2 soldiers on our own soil is a starting point for a national conversation about our future and about sacrifice. To what extent are we willing to sacrifice the hard-won freedoms we enjoy in order to attempt a greater sense of security and safety? How much of our sense of safety are we willing to sacrifice in order to retain as many as possible of those freedoms? Well, this Tuesday, as we remember the sacrifices made by previous generations and the sacrifices still being made and being risked today, we have an opportunity to consider where we stand in that continuum of less freedom, less risk, to more freedom, more risk. Now, as your minister, I have to tell you that Jesus lived way over here on the end of this more freedom, more risk continuum. And I also have to say that living over there cost him his life, caused him to sacrifice his life. I'm not sure how many of us are willing to make that same decision, that same choice, especially if we're making it not just for ourselves, but for others as well. Where we are on this continuum is something that we're going to have to decide for ourselves as individuals and as a nation. But let's get back to the biblical notion of sacrifice, and especially the sacrificial giving of gifts in an offering of thanksgiving. Now, I have never presided at a burnt offering sacrifice, and I don't intend to start. Nevertheless, every time we gather for worship, we include something we call the offering. And like the burnt offerings of grain we heard about in Leviticus, the offering is intended to be a sacrifice inspired by thanksgiving. The practical question that we all have to deal with is, how much of a sacrifice do I offer? What's appropriate? Well, the smart aleck answer is, how thankful are you? But the serious answer, the biblical answer, is that we give 10% of our income. That's called a tithe. Now, the story I like about tithing is this. It's about 2 guys who were flying in a private plane across the ocean, and it crashed, of course, and they survived, and they were washed up on the shore of a deserted island. And the one guy says, oh, what are we going to do? This island is too small to be on any chart, so they'll never find us here. And the other guy says, don't worry. I earn $250,000 a year. Well, the guy goes off and he explores the island, the first guy, to find out, and he comes back and he says, I don't find any food or even any water. Like, we're in world trouble here. Don't worry. I earn $250,000 a year. That's got nothing to do with it. We're lost. We have no food. We have no water. We're going to die a horrible, slow death here. Don't worry. I earn $250,000, and I tithe 10% to my church. My minister will find me. Thank you. Thank you very much. The question remains, how much is appropriate to give? I would say that if you don't notice what you're giving, you're not giving enough. My hope is that we give gladly and cheerfully from a spirit of thanksgiving, but that we give enough for it to pinch a little, enough for us to notice that it's gone. That's the point of 10%. It's doable, especially if you make it a priority, it's doable. But there's a bit of a pinch there. You notice when it's gone. It has an element of sacrifice to it. Now, I recently had an opportunity to look through the brochure for the fundraising campaign to build this church. In 1959, it was published. Here's the cover of it. starts with a definition of Christian stewardship that I heartily endorse. It is the practice of systematic and proportionate giving of time, abilities, and material possessions based on the conviction that these are a trust from God to be used in God's service for the benefit of all humankind in grateful acknowledgement of Christ's redeeming love. That's just about it, all right. And I know that we don't just give to the church, that we give to all kinds of charities as well, but I think that all of our giving comes from this sense of being given a trust from God to be used in God's service. I was struck looking through this brochure about the unapologetic use of the word sacrifice. It's on almost every page. So, the supervising pastor, Reverend Nixon, talks about faith exercised by sacrificial giving. And the student minister, Rick Hart, talks about girding our loins for the sacrifices that we too shall have to make. Bob Smith, the special gifts chairman, talks about a sacrificial gift. The volunteer canvassers. To be a volunteer canvasser means a sacrifice of time and money, and it goes on and on throughout page after page. Now, I know that the 1950s were very different than our own times, but it remains true that the only reason that this church stands here for our benefit and the benefit of our community, and you know, I looked through our calendar this week. There were 25 events scheduled in our calendar this week. 18 of them were community events. The only reason this church stands here is because of the sacrifices made by those who came before us. What sacrifices will we make for those who come after? What future will be our monument? Now, we don't participate in taking a handful of grain and soaking it with oil and sprinkling incense on it and setting it on fire. Instead, we participate in turning money into ministry. But the effect is the same. The tangible transforms to the intangible. The physical transforms to the spiritual. And the echo of that transformation enlivens our living and transforms our spiritual lives. As the brochure says, a generous gift is one which is large enough to have a positive spiritual impact on the giver. That's the key. Still, the question remains, how much is generous? And the fundraising brochure recommends tithing as a guide, and that's where I agree with them. The tithe is a guideline. It's a standard that we can place ourselves, with. If you ask me what is an appropriate amount to give, I'm going to point to that guideline of 10% of income. For most people, that's doable, but it's noticeable too. But I would say that my experience of tithing is that the spiritual benefit is worth every penny. Ultimately, we give not because the church needs our money, although obviously it does, but because our spiritual health depends on the giving of our time, abilities, and material possessions. The brochure ends on the back page with a little parable about the 2 seas in Palestine. And the first of these seas is the Sea of Galilee. And it's a freshwater sea, and there's fish in it, and birds fly over it, and it's surrounded by green growth and trees, and people walk on its shore, and the sound of children laughing is heard. It's the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River comes out of the hill country and feeds into the Sea of Galilee, and then flows out the south end. And then that Jordan River flows into another sea. But in this sea, there are no fish. There are no birds, there's no green growth, there's no trees, there's no children laughing. And the difference between these 2 seas is that the Sea of Galilee receives the Jordan River and gives it up. The other sea only receives, it holds everything it gets. And that sea is called the Dead Sea, for just that reason. Giving is life-giving for others and for ourselves. Amen.